Hey there, welcome back to True Crime Echoes, where we dig through the shadows of history to uncover the crimes, the cover ups, and the cold, hard truths most people would rather forget. I'm your host, and today's episode is something a little different. Instead of focusing on just one case or one story, we're taking a step back and looking at everything we've uncovered this season: the patterns, the lessons, the villains, the unsung heroes, the things that made us gasp, cry, scream, and sometimes laugh out loud in disbelief. We're calling it the Joanie Awards, our own twisted version of an awards show honoring the wildest, most jaw-dropping moments from the dark corners of history. So get comfy. This one's going to take you from outrageous injustice to quiet resilience, from chemical warfare to molasses floods, and from absurd decisions to devastating consequences. Because if history has taught us anything, it's that the past isn't dead. It's not even past. Let's get into it. Chapter 1, Another Year, Another Joanie. I still can't believe we've made it to another Joanie Awards episode. Honestly, it feels like I blinked and a whole season of dark, twisted stories just flew by. Maybe that's what happens when you spend your year diving into cults, corporate greed, failed science experiments, and ghosts from the past that refuse to stay buried. Hi, I'm back. And if you're new here, welcome. My name is Bailey. Just kidding. I'm your host here on True Crime Echoes, and this episode is a little different. It's not about a single case or criminal. It's about all the strange, disturbing, fascinating stories we've uncovered this past season. This is our way of wrapping it all up with a little humor, a lot of heart, and a healthy dose of side-eye for the villains of history. We're calling it the Joanie Awards, named after no one in particular, just a made-up figure that somehow became part of this tradition. Think of it like the Oscars, but for morally bankrupt corporations, forgotten heroes, shocking historical cover-ups, and decisions that make you want to scream, what the hell were they thinking? And just like any glamorous awards show tonight, we've got our guests seated in the front row. Not your average red carpet attendees, though. Look over there. Rasputin showed up again smelling like stale vodka and spiritual manipulation. Across the aisle, Hedy Lamarr, still glowing with the quiet brilliance of a woman far ahead of her time. And I'm pretty sure that's Calamity Jane in the back already, a few drinks in and ready to fight someone. There's no velvet rope, no VIP list. If you've made it onto the Joanie Awards, you've earned your place through chaos, courage, or controversy. But all jokes aside, I want to take a second to say something real. I've spent this past year researching, writing, and retelling some of the darkest corners of our shared history. From murderers who wore masks of civility to governments who got away with poisoning people in plain sight. It's been a lot. Heavy, eye-opening, enraging, but also empowering. Because learning these stories, sitting with them, not looking away, that matters. And I couldn't do any of it without you. So if you've ever commented on a video, shared an episode, sent me a DM saying, "Hey, I'd never heard of this before, thank you." Just know that you're the reason I keep doing this. Truly. Now, tonight's episode isn't just a recap. It's a celebration of the strange, the overlooked, the heartbreaking, and the absurd. We're giving out awards, yes, but really, we're honoring the truths that were buried, the people who were forgotten, and the lessons we should have learned long ago. So buckle up. We've got breakthrough heroes, mind-blowing twists, business badasses, and some of the worst villains you've probably never heard of. This is the 2024 Joanie Awards, and I am so glad you're here with me. Let's get into it. Chapter 2, Breakthrough Character of the Year. All right, let's kick things off with one of my favorite categories, Breakthrough Character of the Year. These aren't necessarily the most famous names in history, but they are the people, or sometimes animals, who made a mark so unforgettable they practically demanded their own spotlight. This year we met a lot of incredible figures, but 3 really stood out. And I mean really stood out. They each represent something different: innovation, sacrifice, and scandal. Let's start with one of the most misunderstood women in history, Hedy Lamarr. Now, most people remember Hedy for her beauty. The camera loved her jet black hair, piercing eyes, this effortless Hollywood glamour. But that's not why she's here. Hedy Lamarr wasn't just a movie star, she was a damn genius. What most people don't know is that during World War II, she co-invented a frequency-hopping communication system, essentially a way to prevent torpedoes from being jammed. And that ticket became the foundation for things we use every single day: Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, GPS. But here's the kicker: because she was an immigrant and a woman, the US government classified her invention as the property of an enemy alien. She was never paid, not a single cent, in her lifetime. She was dismissed, discredited, and forgotten by the very country that benefited from her brilliance. It wasn't until 2014, long after her death, that she was inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame. Imagine that. All those years, people thought she was just a pretty face while the entire world was literally running on her ideas. Next up, I know this sounds wild, but stick with me, a pigeon. Yeah. A pigeon named Cher Ami. And no, this isn't a joke. Cher Ami's story comes from World War I. In 1918, a group of American soldiers, about 200 men, got trapped behind enemy lines. No food, no water, and no way to communicate. They were being shelled by their own allies who didn't realize they were still alive. So in desperation, they attached a message to the leg of their last remaining carrier pigeon, Cher Ami. He took off flying through smoke bullets chaos. He was shot mid-air, dropped to the ground. But somehow, bleeding and barely alive, he got up and flew another 25 miles in 25 minutes, delivering the message that saved those soldiers' lives. That one message meant 194 men lived to go home. Cher Ami lost a leg, took a bullet to the chest, and still completed his mission. I mean, how do you even process that level of loyalty and resilience? He was awarded a medal for bravery, and his tiny body now rests in the Smithsonian. Deserved. And then there's William D'Alton Man, a man who basically invented modern-day celebrity gossip, and not in a good way. He started as a soldier in the Civil War, but later he became a newspaper publisher in New York, and what he did was shady, to say the least. He found dirt on the rich and powerful affairs, financial scandals, secret addictions, and would offer to keep those stories out of the paper for a price. It was blackmail, plain and simple. And yet he laid the groundwork for the entire celebrity gossip industry. Without William D'Alton Man, there'd probably be no TMZ, no tabloid exposés, no clickbait scandal of the week. For better or worse, probably worse, he changed the media forever. So we have a Hollywood actress turned inventor, a one-legged war hero pigeon, and the man who monetized secrets. Quite the mix. And when it came time to vote, I'll admit I was rooting for Hetty. I mean, without her, I probably wouldn't even be recording this on Wi-Fi right now. But when the votes came in, the Joanie for Breakthrough Character of the Year went to Cher Ami. Yeah, the pigeon. And honestly, I get it. In a year full of betrayal cover-ups and cruelty, there's something deeply human, ironically, in the story of a bird who gave everything to save lives. No politics, no ego. Just instinct, sacrifice, and duty. So here's to Cher Ami. May we all be a little more loyal and a little braver when it really counts. Now don't go anywhere, we still have some of the most shocking reveals of the year coming up next. And trust me, some of these are gonna make your jaw drop. Chapter 3, Most Shocking Reveal. Now this next category, honestly, it kind of writes itself. Because if there's one thing that Season 3 of True Crime Echoes has taught me, it's this: truth is often stranger and way darker than fiction. These stories don't need embellishment. They're already shocking enough. We called this category Most Shocking Reveal, and trust me, each nominee had me staring at the wall afterward, just trying to process what I had learned. You ever read something and feel like your brain just pauses? That's what these stories did. First up, we have a revelation from our childbirth episode, the one where we peeled back the curtain on how modern labor practices were shaped. And let me tell you, it was uncomfortable. So here's the thing. For most of human history, women gave birth in upright positions, squatting, kneeling, sometimes even standing. It made sense. Gravity helps. But somewhere along the line, that changed. And the reason why turns out, it was because of a horny king. Yep. King Louis XIV of France. The man had a fetish for watching women give birth. Not in private, not discreetly. He would literally attend royal births and demand that the mother be positioned on her back so he could get a better view. And because he was king, doctors adopted this practice more widely, eventually standardizing it in medical care. And to this day, most women in hospitals still give birth that way flat on their backs because of him. It's disturbing, not just because of the kink, but because of the power. One man's voyeurism reshaped an entire field of medicine, and it still affects women's bodies centuries later. Now, our second nominee is from the episode that really got under my skin: segregated proms. That happened until 2013. Let that sink in for a second. We all know segregation was outlawed in schools back in the 1950s. Brown versus Board of Education was decided in 1954. But it turns out some communities found sneaky ways to keep things separate. Proms, those all-American high school traditions, were being held separately for white and black students in some parts of the country all the way into the 2000s. One of the most glaring examples, Wilcox County, Georgia. In 2013, yes, 2013, the high school held its first ever integrated prom. Before that, they had always been split. No official school prom. Just private ones, one for the white kids, one for the black kids, and that's not the 1960s we're talking about. That was 11 years ago. When I first read that, I had to double-check the date. It felt impossible. But it was real. That's what made it so shocking, not that it happened once upon a time, but that it happened in our time. And finally, the reveal that to this day still chills me the most: the mass graves at the Magdalen Laundries. If you're not familiar, the Magdalen Laundries were institutions run by the Catholic Church in Ireland. On the surface, they were supposed to be places of reform for fallen women. But in reality, they were forced labor prisons. Women and girls were sent there for getting pregnant out of wedlock, or even just for being too pretty or too flirtatious. Sometimes their only crime was being poor or unwanted. They were stripped of their names, denied contact with the outside world, and forced to work long hours in harsh, abusive conditions. Many never left. In 1995, a property developer accidentally discovered a mass grave beneath one of these old church-run facilities. Inside, the remains of 155 women, buried without names, without records, without dignity. And that was just one site. The Magdalen scandal blew wide open after that. Stories of torture, starvation, psychological abuse, decades of systemic cruelty hidden in plain sight. The church denied responsibility, the government shrugged, and the women who survived most never got justice. That's what shook me most. That level of erasure, of institutional violence, of silence. So when it came time to name the winner of Most Shocking Reveal, I think we all knew where this was headed. The Joanie went to the mass graves of the Magdalen Laundries. It wasn't even a contest. Some truths don't just shock you, they scar you. And I think this one did exactly that. But that's the point, right? To not forget. To pull these stories out from the dark corners of history and say, look at this. This happened, and it mattered. There was one honorable mention, though, and it's one that more people really need to know: Fred Hampton. We talked about him in our COINTELPRO episode. Fred was a 21-year-old civil rights leader, a voice of unity and justice. And in 1969, the FBI orchestrated a raid that ended with him being shot and killed in his bed while he slept. No warning, no trial, just cold-blooded execution. Sometimes the real villains don't wear masks or hide in the shadows. Sometimes they operate in broad daylight with badges and legal immunity. So yeah, that was the most shocking reveal of the year. And I have a feeling it'll stay with me for a long time. Stay with me, because next we're moving into one of the more uplifting categories. Business badasses. Women who broke barriers, built empires, and did it all while being told you can't. You're gonna love this one. Chapter 4. Business Badass of the Year. Okay, after all of that heartbreak and horror, I think we deserve a moment to breathe and to celebrate. Because if this season taught me anything, it's that even in the darkest corners of history, there are women who refuse to be forgotten, women who didn't wait for permission, who built empires while the world was trying to erase them. And that brings us to one of my favorite categories, Business Badass of the Year. This isn't about who made the most money. It's about resilience, vision, impact, and the ability to change the game when the game was never made for you to win. Let's start with Mary Ellen Pleasant. Now, I didn't know her name before this season, and that's part of the problem. Because Mary Ellen wasn't just successful, she was a revolutionary. She was born in the early 1800s, likely into slavery. But through a series of smart business moves, hidden alliances, and sheer grit, she built a fortune quietly. On the surface, she worked as a domestic servant in San Francisco. But behind the scenes, she was investing in real estate, starting businesses, and funding abolitionist causes. She used her wealth to fight slavery in court, literally. She helped finance legal battles, supported the Underground Railroad, and even worked with John Brown, one of the most radical anti-slavery figures in American history. They called her the Mother of Civil Rights in California. But instead of being honored, she was smeared. The press called her a voodoo queen. They attacked her character, her race, her gender, because they couldn't stand the idea of a black woman holding that kind of power. And even with all that, she never stopped. She fought, she built, she gave, she was everything this award is about. Next up is someone you've probably never heard of, but should Esther Howland. Her story started with a piece of mail. In the 1840s, her father received a valentine from a business partner in England. Esther was fascinated by it, the lace, the detail, the sentiment. And instead of just admiring it, she thought, why don't we make these here? She designed her own version of the valentine and started selling them. At first, it was just a small operation out of her home in Massachusetts. But pretty quickly, it exploded. She ended up founding one of the first greeting card companies in America. And in doing so, she helped turn Valentine's Day into a billion-dollar industry. Think about that. A woman in the 1800s with no rights, no vote, no real place in the business world saw an opportunity and grabbed it. She created a legacy from paper and glue. And I guarantee you, Hallmark owes her everything. And finally, the icon, the legend Josephine Baker. I couldn't fit Josephine's story into just one episode. I needed two, because her life was that big. She started out in poverty, experienced racism and abuse, and yet rose to become one of the most famous entertainers in the world. But fame wasn't enough. She used her platform to fight. In Nazi-occupied France, she became a spy. She used her tours as cover-passing messages to the Allies written in invisible ink on her sheet music. Later, she returned to the U.S. and fought for civil rights, refusing to perform at segregated venues, marching with Dr. King, and adopting children from around the world to prove that love wasn't bound by race. And on top of all that, she built her own brand. Fashion, makeup, music, performance, she was the whole package. She turned her pain into power, her fame into force, her voice into a weapon. So, yeah, these women weren't just impressive, they were unstoppable. And when the moment came to open the envelope, the Joanie for Business Badass of the Year went to Mary Ellen Pleasant. And honestly, that feels right. Because while all these women shattered expectations, Mary Ellen was operating in total silence. She had to. She lived in a world where her intelligence, her ambition, and her wealth were all seen as threats. And she still built a legacy that echoes across centuries. There was one more woman we couldn't leave out a quick honorable mention, and that's Tippi Hedren. You might know her as the Hitchcock blonde from The Birds. But what you might not know is that she changed the lives of thousands of Vietnamese immigrants. After the Vietnam War, Tippi visited a refugee camp and saw women admiring her nails. She was struck by that moment, this tiny act of beauty in the midst of chaos. So she brought in her personal manicurist to teach them. That moment led to the rise of the Vietnamese nail salon industry in America, a multi-billion-dollar force today. And it all started because one woman paid attention. That's the kind of legacy that doesn't make headlines, but it changes lives. So here's to all the women who built empires in silence, who paved roads with no maps, who used their pain to make something lasting. You're not just business badasses, you're blueprints. Coming up next, a category that's a little messier, a little darker, and honestly, a little infuriating. It's time for What the Hell Were They Thinking? And I promise, you're not ready. Chapter 5. What the hell were they thinking? Now we've honored heroes. We've cried over injustice. We've celebrated trailblazers. But now it's time for something different. It's time for the stories that had me literally yelling at my screen. The kind of decisions, so bad, so mind-numbingly reckless, that all you can say is, What the hell were they thinking? This category is, well, it's basically a history of human failure. And believe me, we had a lot of contenders this season. First up, Senator Ted Kennedy and the Chappaquiddick incident. You may have heard of it. Or maybe you haven't, because for years people tried to bury it. But it happened in the summer of 1969 when Ted Kennedy, yes, that Kennedy drove off a bridge with a young woman named Mary Jo Kopechne in the car. The car plunged into the water. She didn't make it out. But here's where it turns from tragedy to outrage. He didn't call for help. He swam to shore, walked past several houses, and went back to his hotel. For hours. He never reported the accident until the next day, while Mary Jo's body was still trapped inside the sunken car. And when investigators later looked into the crash, they found something chilling. She didn't drown immediately. She may have been alive in that car for a while, possibly scared, trapped, and waiting. That's the part that's hard to live with, that he didn't even try. And yet, Ted Kennedy continued his political career. No charges stuck. The Kennedy name, like always, shielded him. And I still find myself thinking what would have happened if he wasn't a Kennedy. What if it were just some regular man? Would he have gotten away with it? Next up is a decision that cost lives on a very public stage, the Challenger disaster. If you were alive in the 1980s, this one's probably burned into your memory. In 1986, NASA launched the Challenger space shuttle, and it exploded just 73 seconds after takeoff, killing all 7 crew members, including Krista McAuliffe, who was set to become the first civilian teacher in space. At the time, people called it an accident. But when you peel back the layers, it wasn't just a tragedy, it was the result of a series of ignored warnings. Engineers had raised concerns about a part called the O-rings. These rubber seals weren't meant to function in cold temperatures. And on the day of the launch, it was freezing, literally below the safe operating range. The people who built the rocket said, "Please don't do this." But NASA pushed ahead anyway. Why? Because of public pressure, scheduling, and image. They wanted a win. They wanted headlines. And they got them, just not the kind they expected. What makes this one hurt even more is that it was preventable. That shuttle didn't have to explode. Those lives didn't have to be lost. But somewhere along the way, looking good became more important than being safe. And then there's Dr. Conrad Murray. You probably know the name from the death of Michael Jackson. In 2009, the world was stunned when the king of pop died suddenly in his Los Angeles home. The cause, a lethal dose of propofol, a powerful sedative usually reserved for surgery. Now Michael called it milk. That's what he nicknamed it. He had trouble sleeping, and propofol became his nightly fix. But here's the thing. No ethical doctor would ever use that at home, especially not without the proper equipment or monitoring. But Dr. Murray did, and he left the room. He wasn't monitoring Michael's breathing, his vitals. Nothing. When he came back, it was already too late. He claimed it was an accident. But the autopsy was clear. This wasn't a slip-up. This was gross negligence. You're not supposed to give one of the most powerful anesthetics in the world to someone just because they can't fall asleep, especially not someone who was already fragile and dependent. So when the Joanie for "What the hell were they thinking?" had to be handed out, the competition was tight. Every nominee made choices that had consequences, real irreversible consequences. But only one of them swam away from a drowning woman and stayed silent while the clock ran out. The award went to Ted Kennedy. And honestly, yeah, I agree. Because while the others were tragic and senseless, what happened on Chappaquiddick Island was personal. He had a choice. He had time. He had a chance to do the right thing, and he didn't. It's the silence that echoes loudest in that story. The hours where nothing was said. The hours where a powerful man hoped his name would erase his crime. And for the most part, it did. But here, in our little corner of the internet, we're not letting that slide. We're remembering. We're calling it out. Because that's what accountability looks like. Coming up next is something a little weirder, but still deeply telling. We're diving into the logos, brands, and symbols that have quietly taken over our collective minds. It's time for another quiz, and a reminder of just how easy it is to be influenced without even realizing it. Chapter 6. Villain of the Year. You know, I used to think the word villain was reserved for fairy tales, for people who twirl their mustaches and tie damsels to train tracks. But after spending an entire season neck deep in history's darkest corners, I can confidently say real villains don't wear capes. They wear lab coats, business suits, government badges, and sometimes they're so embedded in the system that we don't even notice them until the damage is already done. This brings us to our final and most uncomfortable category, Villain of the Year. Now, when I say villain, I'm not talking about someone who just made a bad decision. I'm talking about people and institutions whose actions left a path of destruction so wide, so deliberate, that there's no room for misunderstanding their intent. These aren't mistakes. These are calculated abuses of power. First up, let's talk about Senator Joseph McCarthy. This guy was a master manipulator, one of those people who knew exactly how to exploit fear. Back in the 1950s, during the height of the Cold War, McCarthy convinced the American public that communism wasn't just a political ideology, it was an infection, and anyone could be a carrier. But he didn't stop there. He tied communism to homosexuality. He launched a campaign called the Lavender Scare, where thousands of government workers were investigated, fired, or forced to resign, not because they were spies, but because they were gay. He made being queer synonymous with being disloyal, dangerous, and weak. Imagine living in that world, where your identity wasn't just judged, it was criminalized, where someone could ruin your life with a single rumor. That was McCarthy. He didn't just ruin careers, he ruined lives, and all in the name of control. Our next nominee is a name that still gives me chills: Monsanto. If you've ever eaten corn-used weed killer or walked barefoot on a lawn in suburbia, chances are you've crossed paths with this company. Monsanto was a biotech giant responsible for genetically modified crops and industrial-scale farming. But behind the science was something much darker. They produced Agent Orange, a chemical used during the Vietnam War that caused horrific birth defects, cancer, and death for both American soldiers and Vietnamese civilians. They also developed Roundup, a herbicide containing glyphosate, a chemical now linked to cancer. And here's the thing they knew. Internal documents later showed that Monsanto had research pointing to the dangers of their products, but they buried it, lied about it, and went after anyone who tried to speak up. Farmers, scientists, journalists, it didn't matter. If you questioned Monsanto, you became a target. I still remember reading about families who lived near those fields, people who got sick, whose kids were born with abnormalities, and realizing it wasn't an accident. It was the cost of doing business. And finally, our wild card nominee, molasses. Okay, hear me out. I know it sounds ridiculous. How could molasses, sweet sticky molasses, be a villain? Well, in 1919, Boston learned the hard way that sometimes even the most innocent things can turn deadly. A massive storage tank holding over 2 million gallons of molasses exploded in the North End. The resulting wave moved at 35 miles per hour, flattening buildings, crushing people, and killing 21 individuals, many of them children. You know what made it worse? The tank had been leaking for months. People complained. They reported strange noises, cracks, even the smell. But the company that owned it ignored every warning. They were in a rush. They wanted to meet demand, they cut corners, and people paid the price. It's easy to laugh at something called the Great Molasses Flood, until you realize it was a direct result of negligence, greed, and indifference to human life. And suddenly, it's not so funny anymore. So who took home the Joanie for Villain of the Year? It wasn't even close. Monsanto. Because while McCarthy fueled paranoia and molasses left a city reeling, Monsanto's reach was and still is global. They didn't just manipulate governments. They poisoned generations. They used science as a shield and capitalism as a weapon. And the worst part, they're still around. They got bought by Bayer, rebranded, polished up, but the damage that remains, in the soil, in the bloodstream, in the history books. What defines a villain isn't just what they do, it's how long it echoes. And Monsanto's legacy, it's still echoing. We've reached the end of our Joanie Awards, but not the end of the stories. Because history doesn't end when the episode does. It lingers. It teaches. It warns. And here on True Crime Echoes, we're going to keep listening. Until next time, stay curious, stay questioning, and never stop asking, what else have we been told to forget? Chapter 7 echoes that stay. And just like that, we've reached the end. I don't know about you, but every time I finish an episode like this, especially one like this, I feel like I've been through something. Not just entertained, but changed a little. Like something inside me got quieter, and something else got louder. We laughed, we rolled our eyes, we shook our heads in disbelief. But most of all, we remembered. That's what this has always been about, remembering. Because history, especially the kind most people avoid talking about, is full of people who were silenced, forgotten, rewritten, or erased entirely. And every time we bring their names back into the light, even for a moment, we're doing something radical. We're pushing back against the forgetting. Whether it was a war hero pigeon, a woman who invented Wi-Fi and never got credit, or the lives buried under molasses and corporate negligence, these stories matter. Not because they're shocking, but because they're true. And truth, no matter how uncomfortable, always deserves space. I know it can get heavy. Believe me. There were days while researching this season where I just had to close my laptop and sit in silence. Days I questioned whether digging into all of this darkness was even worth it. But then I'd get a message from one of you, a comment that said, "I had no idea this ever happened. Thank you for telling it." Or someone would write, "This episode helped me understand something I was never taught in school." And just like that, I'd remember why I started this. True crime isn't just murder and mystery. Sometimes it's policies. Sometimes it's corporations. Sometimes it's a cultural silence that lets harm echo through generations. And in every case, there's one common thread: someone knew better and chose not to act. But we can choose differently. We can act by learning, by questioning, by refusing to let the past rot in a footnote. So if you're here still listening after 45 minutes of history, horror, and heartbreak, thank you. You're part of this work. You're helping to carry these stories forward, and I'm grateful for every second of your time. Next season, we're going deeper. We're going to talk about murderous dictators, toxic industries, cover-ups that span decades, and yes, more of those strange little corners of history that seem almost too bizarre to be real until you realize they are. Because that's what True Crime Echoes is all about. The things that aren't always front-page news, but that still shape our world in ways we feel long after the headlines fade. So until then, stay curious, stay critical, and remember, silence is never neutral. Speak. Question. Echo. I'll see you next season. If you made it to the end, thank you. Seriously. In a world where everything moves so fast, the fact that you chose to sit with me for this long, to reflect on these stories, these names, these lives, it means more than I can say. And if any part of this episode made you feel something: rage, hope, confusion, clarity, then I'd love to hear about it. Leave a comment, start a conversation, share the story. Because the more we talk about these echoes of the past, the harder they are to silence. Don't forget to subscribe to True Crime Echoes if you haven't already. I've got a lot coming your way in the next season: more untold stories, more uncomfortable truths, and more reasons to never stop asking, why didn't I know about this before? Until then, stay aware, stay curious, and take care of yourself. The past may be dark, but the more we face it, the more light we can bring to the present. I'll see you soon.